David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
When we talk about the damage that the anti-vaccine movement does and has done, we usually talk about putting individual kids at risk or causing localized breakouts of diseases that maybe we thought we had eradicated or almost completely eradicated. But there's now a new report that confirms that the anti-vaccine movement's negative effects are way bigger than a lot of people are giving them credit for. The anti-vaccine movement has actually undone decades of progress in disease prevention, and it's truly disgusting. This is one of those kooky movements that is actually really damaging and threatening to human health. Flat eartherism. We've talked about flat eartherism before. If you push me, I can come up with some indirect ways in which flat eartherism connects with other things that are damaging more broadly, but it is sort of a stretch. Anti-vax is truly a disaster. The WHO no longer considers measles eradicated in the United Kingdom, in now Albania, the Czech Republic, and Greece, which have also lost their previous measles-free status. And this is because of the anti-vaccine movement, which claims, as you know, that measles is just not super serious. It's not that common. Most people don't die of it. So therefore, it's not necessary to be vaccinated against measles. And of course, what they fail to understand with that, they might call it logic, but it's really the opposite, is that because of vaccines over the last 50 years, measles is not very prevalent. And that is because the measles vaccine has been so effective. Remember that measles used to kill more than 2.5 million people per year in the early 1960s, right before the measles vaccine was introduced. And this has actually happened because this has gone beyond just people on the internet repeating the nonsense. Because you see even elected officials in some places, if not openly supporting anti-vax, at least sort of playing coy with it or conceding some elements of it, like even our president, Donald Trump, did during the 2016 Republican primary. You may remember during Republican debates, Donald Trump parroting anti-vax talking points. This also relates to the post-truth sort of element of the internet age, where when you try to engage with these people and try to ask the normal questions one would ask about evidence and all of this other stuff, they'll say, listen, you know what? In the end, your mind is made up and my mind is made up. And somehow those positions are supposed to be considered equivalent, even though the science is all on one side. They pretend that this is just a matter of perspective, for example, or the freedom to just believe what you want to believe. It is extraordinarily infuriating. And some incorrectly will say, oh, anti-vaxxers are just really dumb. That's all. It's just, these are stupid people lacking intellectual capacity. I don't believe that this is true at all. I think that anti-vaxxers are likely of average intelligence to slightly above average intelligence, but they have a combination of intellectual insecurity combined with either conspiratorial tendencies and or an extreme antipathy towards government or corporations, depending on which side of the anti-vax movement they exist on. And it becomes sort of a perfect storm for getting pulled down or going down the rabbit hole, combined, by the way, with living in a time where, thanks to vaccines, there are way fewer issues with many conditions, which unfortunately just reinforces this idea that vaccines are not only bad and harmful, but potentially completely unnecessary. And then on the back end, this lends itself to massive propaganda efforts. We talked about how Russian trolls and these disinformation campaigns took advantage of trying to foment racial unrest by using targeted social media posts in places where there have been issues like in Ferguson, Missouri, or in Baltimore, already racial issues often involving police. Russian trolls have taken advantage of that. Russian trolls are also believed to be using and spreading anti-vaccination propaganda in the same way. There are numerous headlines you can find. Russian trolls promoted anti-vaccination propaganda, which may have caused measles outbreak, according to one group of researchers. And believing in this stuff is, in a sense, a choice, in that it's so easy to just do a simple Google search and you find authoritative sources that tell you MMR is not linked to autism, dispelling all of the other myths. So it lends itself to propagandization by adversaries in the exact same way that Russia has tried and succeeded in fomenting racial unrest through their social media campaigns. This is really bad stuff. And most of the people in the movement don't understand the role that they are playing and the importance of this in connecting to so many of these other movements, which I think they would probably be fighting against if they understood the interrelatedness. So this is really bad. This is not flat earth stuff, which has sort of minimal systemic and broader impacts. They are undoing decades of progress. The WHO sees it. There are a number of good reports about it now. And unfortunately, this you wouldn't think this being a sort of rational, accepting of science, a program with an audience that mostly does the same. Every time I talk about this, I get very angry emails from anti-vax people in the audience who say, you're usually right on most stuff, but on this, you're just missing the boat, David. It's dangerous stuff. It really is. The White House that was supposedly going to be all about transparency and openness and keeping the American people informed and part of the communication about what they're doing has now gone 6 months without holding a traditional press briefing. There's been a different press secretary. There is a different press secretary in place now than 6 months ago, but it has been 6 full months and there is no sign that the White House is going to resume these press briefings. And part of the problem is probably that the current press secretary wouldn't be able to handle press briefings. Her name is Stephanie Grisham. She replaced, of course, Sarah Huckabee Sanders when Sanders left. And recently, Stephanie Grisham put out a statement answering questions about why are there no press briefings? And this is genius in the sense that it is evil disinformation genius. They are indirectly referring to Twitter to excuse not having press briefings. Check this out and look at the language that's used. Quote, this is White House Press Secretary Stephanie Grisham to ABC News. President Trump communicates directly with the American people more than any president in history. The fact that the White House press corps can no longer grandstand on TV is of no concern to us. She's essentially saying Trump speaks directly to the American people. She means Twitter, right? And thus, we don't even really need press briefings where, of course, reporters get to ask questions and sometimes call lies out. Instead, Trump goes on Twitter, where it is one-way communication, with Trump blocking detractors on Twitter, people he doesn't like, and no opportunity for serious follow-ups from actual journalists. That is what they are using to defend not having a press briefing in 6 months, despite claiming both before and during the presidency that they are the most open and transparent administration in history, which, of course, only an idiot or someone consistently and persistently misinformed would ever fall for. And what's happening is that Grisham really can't handle what it is that would happen during a press briefing. Aside from not even doing the briefings, she also has done barely any interviews. I'm aware of only one that she did with that right-wing TV station ownership group, Sinclair Broadcast Group. And specifically, the interviewer was that right-wing commentator, Eric Bolling. I don't even get what she's doing to earn her salary. She's not talking to the press in press briefings. She's barely doing interviews. I don't even really understand the point. And of course, part of the explanation that the press briefings are merely something that allow the press corps, which they've characterized as just liberal, which is of course not true, that it's merely a venue for the press corps to grandstand. This is another authoritarian tendency. It's part of the press is bad. Letting the press ask questions is bad. Instead, we are going to do one-way communication, which is reminiscent of the endless speeches of the despotic dictators the world over, ranging from, we don't have to mention the German guy, but we can just go more recently. Castro would just do one-way communication. The Chavez-Maduro duo loves one-way communication with no opportunity for challenging and pushing back against what's being said. This is a hallmark of those with authoritarian tendencies. And this is actually particularly of concern because it actually might set a new standard or a new expectation even for future presidents. There would be, I'm hoping, future presidents that don't have the anti-media authoritarian tendencies of Donald Trump, that don't share his disdain for the press. But if we go not 6 months, but another year and a half up until the next inauguration, if Trump loses, that would be 2 years of no press briefings or almost no press briefings. It may start to seem like the norm even for future presidents. I hope that that's not the case, but that is a concern. The most transparent administration in history, right? All they do is lie and obfuscate and then cancel the few opportunities that even exist to ask questions about those lies and obfuscations. And they defend it with, well, Trump's tweeting. He's communicating directly with the American people, so it's all fine. This is the authoritarian slide that we've been talking about for years at this point. Let me know what you think. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. And I hope you'll join me tonight on Twitch for a live stream, twitch.tv/David Pakman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Jamie Smith and Levy Morgan. Thanks to both of you. Really appreciate your support, and I hope you'll be with us for many, many years. Someone who has been is Rachel Barrett. Rachel is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. Join all of these great people at joinpakman.com. Coupon code saves you 40%. This is 2020. Available but not mandatory. The David Pakman Show subreddit is now approaching 15,000 subscribers. I hope you will find it at davidpakman.com/Reddit. A number of posts, including this one about the Tulsi Gabbard Dave Rubin interview, which I have not talked about on the show. A user named Hugga4You says, in light of Tulsi Gabbard's appearance on the Rubin Report, where she claims the other Dems are essentially pushing for open borders, here are everyone's actual stated positions. And this post links to a very, very detailed Wikipedia entry that confirms the Democratic candidates are not for open borders. I'll be honest, I saw about a quarter of that interview. I think it was about 70 minutes. I must have watched about 15. And I was thinking of doing a story on the show about it, but I was so disgusted with it that I couldn't sit through it all in order to compile the best or really the worst moments for you. I would check it out if I were you, but I'm not. It's just really, really bad between the horribly right-wing framed questions and the even worse answers from Tulsi Gabbard. It's just bad. And I encourage you to watch it, but I'm not going to be covering it on the program. Also from the David Pakman Show subreddit, has David been too soft on Elizabeth Warren lately? Some Jerk 27 says, is it just me or has David not been criticizing much Elizabeth Warren lately? He seems to be very much ignoring her flaws, such as her not having enough political courage to fight for her policies, not being willing to challenge the establishment and lead a true political revolution, not being hard on Medicare for all, and of course, her foreign policy. Warren is a watered down version of Sanders. We even saw her kissing up to party insiders behind closed doors. David Pakman seems to be silent about all of this. Oh no, it's not that I'm silent on it. It's that at the very beginning, I told you that although on policy, Bernie and Warren end up in similar places, you need to understand that Warren's origins, not oranges, but her origins are much more establishment than Bernie's. And I've been ahead of this. It's not that I'm ignoring it. It's that I've been telling you about this for a year or longer at this point in time. Make sure you're subscribed to the subreddit at davidpakman.com/REDDIT at nearly 15,000 subscribers. It is one of the largest independent progressive media subreddit communities out there. I don't know, in the world. I guess the world is hard to say. Certainly from American independent progressive media for sure. davidpakman.com/Reddit. Speaking of Elizabeth Warren, yesterday I told you that Elizabeth Warren had taken a 1-point lead in the New Hampshire primary over Biden and a 2-point lead in New Hampshire over Bernie. Now, since then, we have had another New Hampshire poll which shows Bernie ahead. And we also have a new national economist poll, which has Elizabeth Warren tied with Joe Biden nationally, 26-26. This is not a single state, okay? This is national polling. Other than a single Monmouth poll in mid-August, Joe Biden has led every poll nationally, dating all the way back to before he even announced he was running. And we now have tonight a Democratic primary debate where Elizabeth Warren is at least in one poll, not trying to catch Joe Biden, but co-frontrunner with Joe Biden at 26-26. So let's look at this one poll. And remember, it's just one poll, but this is still very, very notable. Also notable is that in this poll, Bernie Sanders is all the way down to 16%, which I actually do find difficult to believe. So it's always important to consider one poll no more than that. It is just one data point. Unless there has been a significant real shift away from Bernie towards Warren, it's difficult to imagine that both Bernie and Warren are each 10 points ahead of Bernie, but this is one poll. So now that we've seen this, what you need to do is nothing different. What I mean is it's the same situation as always. You need to stay engaged. You need to go vote when your state votes, no matter what the polls say. But this is very interesting in terms of the dynamics for tonight's debate, which for me has become a lot more interesting in light of these recent polling changes. Will the tone and the feel of tonight's debate be different because Warren is no longer, at least in this poll, trying to come from behind Biden and make her case, but rather a co-frontrunner? If you were Biden, are you panicking? Maybe not. It's unclear how much Joe Biden actually wants to be president, but presuming that he really does want to be president of the United States, if you are Joe Biden, you have to be worried about Elizabeth Warren's momentum. I got some emails yesterday in light of this new poll saying, hey, David, Biden should step down. I find this a little bit silly. Rarely would anyone who is leading, even if it's tied for the lead, step aside unless the argument about momentum is so overwhelming and Biden really doesn't want to be president of the United States. I don't see Biden stepping down anytime soon, but now there is a real fight. And the questions of speaking time in tonight's debate will be immediate questions. We tend to see those who are leading get disproportionately more speaking time. And while in one sense that's completely unfair, in another sense it's completely expected once you understand the corporate nature of these debates on the major networks, will speaking time be impacted by the fact that at least in this poll, Elizabeth Warren is a co-frontrunner with Joe Biden? We will have to see. I hope you will join me for a pre-debate stream on YouTube a half hour before the debate starts, and then live debate commentary over on Twitch at twitch.tv/David Pakman. If, and this is a big, big if nobody shuts us down. All of that tonight. Let me know what you think about this new poll.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Maximillian Alvarez, who's a writer based in Baltimore, a dual PhD candidate in history and comparative literature at the University of Michigan, and also the host of Working People, a podcast by, for, and about the working class today. It's so great to have you on today. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me.
So let's just jump right in and talk a little bit about, I guess even how to introduce the subject is already sort of part of the issue. Do we want to talk about fascism? Do we want to talk about Antifa? Do we want to talk about protest movements? I don't really know what the right way to frame the conversation is, so maybe I'll let you do it. What do you think is the fundamental sort of crux of what we should be talking about right now regarding the movement against fascism that is often seen through protests in the media?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that's the question that we should all be asking, right? Because I think that, one of the biggest constraints to, anti-fascist politics is kind of wading through all the kind of negative portrayals and biases that, we get in the media of anti-fascism, or that we kind of absorb from the environment about what anti-fascism is. And, part of the work that I do and so many others do is try to, really get into kind of the meat and bones of what anti-fascist politics is, and try to kind of get people to understand that, anti-fascism shouldn't be a bad thing, right? Living a life that is expressly non-fascist, right? That is devoted to preventing, fascism or fascist-like politics from ever emerging again. That should be a thing that we should all want. And so in that regard, I think, what's really important is to kind of understand what the stakes are of preventing fascism or fascist-like politics from growing in this country or beyond this country, and the ways that, everyday working people are more closely aligned with the politics of anti-fascism than I think they realize. But again, we tend to kind of associate anti-fascism as such, with a couple of like repeated media portrayals of certain tactics of certain anti-fascist groups that really miss the larger picture of how the point of anti-fascism, right, is to inoculate our society from kinds of the conditions that lead people to find fascism attractive, right? This is a conversation that, I've been having and that others have been having, since before Donald Trump was elected, right? Because I think Jeff Ely, who's a professor at the University of Michigan and a specialist in the politics of Nazi Germany, put it really well, when he said that, we get into a lot of discussions about whether or not Donald Trump is fascist, whether or not this or that policy is fascist, this or that group of people is fascist. And that gets us bogged down kind of in, I think a kind of roundabout discussion about whether or not our historical conditions right now in the American present kind of map on, beat by beat to the conditions of, Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, or Italy, with the rise of Mussolini. And, I think it's kind of like a maze without an exit, right? Because history's never going to kind of repeat itself point by point. And I think that Jeff Ely's really instructive here when he says that, history's never going to repeat itself precisely. And so the more important question is not to ask whether or not, this or that person is, fascist by some sort of kind of textbook definition that leads us to believe that there is only like one kind of historical kind of potion for creating fascism, right? The question is like, what sorts of historical conditions lead more and more people, a critical mass of people, to find fascism or fascist-like politics more attractive?
Well,
And I
to focus in on what you said about the portrayals in media, I mean, so I consider myself most aligned with the political movement called social democracy. And when I look at social democracy, I see an anti-fascist worldview, an anti-fascist ideology. When you look at fascism as, this right-wing, often very nationalist authoritarianism that sometimes has dictatorial power, but not always. Like, as you're talking about, it's not always exactly the same. I can think of no progressive ideology of any kind that wouldn't be strongly against that. And so what I wanted to kind of pose to you is, when you talk about the media portrayals of people in whatever city who are, doing some violent act or whatever the case may be, have they perverted the anti-fascist movement, or are they, in a sense, I see a contradiction in the tactics, as you talk about, of some, in that they are very authoritarian tactics claiming to fight against a slightly different form of authoritarianism. So what is the kind of right way to interpret those tactics and the media portrayals thereof?
So can I ask a quick clarifying question
Yeah.
by what you mean in that context by authoritarian tactics?
Well, in my view, if I were to decide that in order to protest some version of authoritarianism, I am going to foist acts of violence upon people who are just existing in society and trying to go about their life, for example, or working a job or whatever the case may be. To me, that seems like an authoritarian tactic, which I am engaging in order to fight supposed authoritarianism. And I don't mean supposed in the sense that I don't believe it's there. I do. But what I identify as authoritarianism, I am saying I am going to impose what I see as a solution to authoritarianism with something that is, in a sense, also authoritarian.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think so I get where you're coming from. And, I know that this is a conversation that we kind of get bogged down in, right? Is, a lot of folks, when they're talking about anti-fascist politics, they kind of require that in order to even have the conversation, we need to kind of condemn certain tactics as violent and counterproductive. And I 100% get where you're coming from in terms of the optics of these sorts of tactics and, how much they sync up with a broader, movement, a more popularized movement of, everyday anti-fascism. And, I think the when we're asked to kind of condemn certain violent tactics like black bloc tactics, I mean, black bloc itself is not even like an expressly and necessarily violent tactic. A lot of it is based on kind of community defense. I mean, if you look at like the J20 trials, you can see exactly why people wear masks, because the government tried to kind of in almost unprecedented way charge over 300 people with kind of conspiracy to riot just because they were wearing the same thing. And that's because they couldn't pick out any single one person because of the masks. And that's part of the kind of protective tactic. But to the point that you're asking about, if, someone punches Richard Spencer, or if like a Bank of America window gets broken, and that this, as you said, is the optics of this are kind of protesters foisting, I think you said, like a certain, what looks like an authoritarian tactic onto, a presumably neutral kind of world or neutral people. I think that that's why it's so important to kind of understand what the stakes of anti-fascism are, because I think what anti-fascism argues is that, this sort of framing of the question kind of presumes a certain state of normal nonviolence that we live in every day, or that we aren't endorsing certain forms of violence already, and that these tactics are not in any way an expression of frustration and desperation against the pre-existing forms of violence that exist in our society.
Well,
right?
so let me jump in there. Maybe we may just disagree as to what tactics are acceptable, which would be fine. I mean, that's a reasonable disagreement to have. But I guess in order to figure that out, I don't disagree that, for example, the financial system status quo that we have in the United States confers or includes a type of violence against, the average person who has either a student loan or ends up needing payday loans, or, overdrafts endlessly because they already don't have money, so the bank then is charging. I get that there is a form of violence in that, but I guess in order to inform our audience who may not be familiar with you, would that type of violence be countered with something like punching someone in the face? Do you see them as equivalent in some way? Or you did mention some unproductive tactics. Maybe I'm wondering which ones you meant by that. We may just have a different list, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, and I appreciate, the framing of the question, because I think this is a productive way to discuss things. I mean, I would say first and foremost, I do not see myself in any position to kind of judge the tactics of people that I'm not organizing with, right? I've been in situations where people have done things that I think are endangering the bulk of us, and we will hash that out internally. Like if people, are provoking police from the outside while a group of us are kind of face to face with the police, it is not tactically sound, right, to kind of goad police into arresting us when, we could possibly avoid that. But at the same time, like I said, I do not feel like I have any place to judge kind of the expressions of frustration and desperation that people feel when, as you said, we live in such a kind of perpetual state of everyday violence that the politics of fascism kind of exacerbates and accentuates, like as we creep further into it. And, that's I think what my biggest problem is with kind of the framing of the violence question, right? Because while I think many average people, are again expressly committed to not wanting fascism in this country, I think that their knee-jerk kind of revulsion to kind of seeing someone get punched or a window getting broken, I think it comes from a good place. But what I would ask people to consider is that, how that question of condemning violence from protesters in the same way that we are asked to condemn the violence of black protesters after, Darren Wilson kills, a young black kid, like near St. Louis or here in Baltimore where I am, we're asking ourselves not to see context, right? We're asking ourselves to pretend that it's not incredibly weird and bad that we only ever seem to apply the term violence to the powerless.
Well, I mean, okay, so I guess it depends on who we're talking about. I think that there are plenty of people who have a more nuanced view, which is there are actually multiple types of violence, and one may recognize that and not believe that, for example, punching someone is morally equivalent to a form of violence, for example, from a financial institution. But because you're right that it is really, you said you don't want to judge necessarily, and you talk about the revulsion. I am a very pragmatic thinker, maybe to a fault. When I think of the pragmatic effect of some of these tactics, given that I share the goal of being against fascism, that's where a lot of my concern comes from, where I wonder what is the end game and how might some of those tactics ultimately achieve the change that I want. I don't see it. And that's why without having to ask, I have not ever been asked to denounce this, that, or the other thing, other than once Richard Spencer asked me if I denounce Pol Pot. And I said, yes, I do. That's an easy one. But that's a story for another day. I've said I don't endorse these tactics because I fundamentally, aside from my moral assessment, don't think that they will achieve the change that I want. And maybe the pragmatics are more easy to discuss than the morality.
Mm-hmm. I think, yeah, I definitely understand more, right? Because, yeah, I think to your point that if we get bogged down in a moral discussion about violence and pacifism, right, like we were saying before, you end up getting, backing yourself into kind of a logical corner where you are blinding yourself to all the existing forms of violence that kind of produce this sort of political outrage, political desperation, and people feeling the need to defend their communities using whatever tactics they have available to them, especially when the state itself is not listening to them. Martin Luther King famously said that riots are the voice of the unheard, right? And I think that is another ingredient to the question of how close we are to fascism, fascist-like politics, is when people lose faith in, government having any sort of ability to kind of address these issues. They need to turn to community defense. And then I think we get into the real tissue of the question that you asked. Okay, if this is what we're up against, then how tactically sound, is it to go in this or that direction? And here is where I think, again, the politics of everyday anti-fascism is so crucial, right? Because, we live in a sensationalist, kind of media environment. It's just kind of the world that we live in. And naturally, the clip of Richard Spencer getting punched is the thing that just gets way more play than all the rest of, anti-fascist politics that occurs, And to their credit, there are groups across the United States, whether it's like Pop Mob in Portland, even like DSA, like Rose City Antifa. There's so many groups that are doing anti-fascism in ways that tactically I think are more aligned with what you're asking. Because again, the goal is to inoculate our society from fascism taking root. And the way that you do that, right, is to build community, to build solidarity, to protect one another, to find joy in your community in ways that kind of prevent lonely, desperate, angry people from latching themselves on to a reactionary, vicious, violent, jingoistic and ethno-nationalist point of view.
I just don't see some of the tactics that I've seen employed achieving that. In other words, I think that they generate more unrest and fear and all of the. I mean, listen, here's where I think I'm struggling with the. I would never. I don't believe in universal disarmament, and I would never sort of preemptively suggest, here's the list of things that no matter how bad it gets, no one should or will ever do. I think that is a problem, as you're pointing out. However, when half the country doesn't vote, I mean, okay, a lot of people say voting doesn't really matter because the system is set up to make it so that it doesn't really matter. We've not tried it. Half the country doesn't vote. Every recent election at certainly the national level, if not state level, and even at more local levels, if we had full voter engagement, we would have a drastically different situation right now. There's a whole list of other tactics I've talked about, including mass rallies at urban centers, strategic loan defaults, which would cripple the finance. There's this whole long list of stuff that's never been done that doesn't go to physical violence. So I'm not ready to say we're at the point where those are the tactics that would be the next ones on my list. And of course, people can disagree with that.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I wrote this article for the Baffler last year called Anti-Fascism and the Left's Fear of Power, where, we were talking about different tactics, but I think it overlaps somewhat with the discussion that we're having here, right? Because, again, I get where you're coming from, and I think that from a tactical discussion, we can have a more productive back and forth than, if we get bogged down in a moral discussion about absolute pacifism. And, this was a criticism that we faced, in the Stop Spencer Coalition when we were mobilizing against Richard Spencer's impending appearance at Michigan State and the University of Michigan. We got a lot of pushback, including from people on the left who said, this is not tactically sound. It is going to turn people against you. Just ignore, Richard Spencer and the KKK members and all the white nationalists who were surrounding our community, who we knew were going to be there, and who we knew were going to use this opportunity to occupy our community and instill fear in the people that, are most vulnerable in our communities. And I think that just like we were talking about kind of the presumption of violence only existing when, people kind of lash out after sustaining just years and years and years of oppressive violence from the state, from the economy, let alone from, structures of racism, misogyny, homophobia, so on and so forth, right? Just in that sort of way, the presumption that that we are not already kind of backsliding on, like a kind of political hill, I think is tactically unsound. I think that, for those who were criticizing us for saying that this was only going to give like the right more ammunition to kind of police dissent on campus communities, my response was like, do you think they're not doing that already? Like they've been doing this.
Yeah, they are doing that already. I guess I might approach it from a slightly more macro perspective, which is when I think about the big advancements of the last 120 years, and I may just have the history wrong on this, and we would sort that out. It seems as though they have been linked to a particular type of activism that did not rely on these tactics. So when I think about like the New Deal of the post-World War II era, when I think about Martin Luther King, who you mentioned, when I think about some of the significant, I mean, it's not enough, but in the context, significant regulatory advancements of the late 80s and early 90s, when I think about that stuff, it seems that although we may all agree it's not enough, that those are pretty significant advancements that we can point to that came primarily on the back of not what we would call I'm distinguishing non-physically violent activism. Am I just wrong about the history?
No, I think you're right, but I think again, like I was saying with my problem with the question about like condemning violence is that it's asking us to ignore context. I think that we all, I mean, this is just the way that we look at history, right? It's impossible to kind of know everything that was going on at the time. And so, through history books and narratives, right, we get a more distilled version of what happened. And I think that putting these, great and important nonviolent movements in context is really important, right? Because, for Martin Luther King and many factions of the civil rights movement, nonviolence was a very important tactic to maintain. But it was also taking place within the context of increasing militancy from other, factions of a civil rights and kind of, black liberatory movement, right? That was also informing the decisions of people in power, right? Just the March on Washington would not have scared, the white establishment as much if they were not also, thinking about, armed, black citizens kind of like protecting their communities, right? Or if they hadn't seen, what responses communities are kind of left with when, they feel like there's nowhere to turn and they're facing violence from the state every day. And so I think that history is messy and there are always kind of more complicated contexts than we give it credit for.
Well, it seems like we definitely are on the same page. In terms of a lot of the context, it does seem like the fundamental area of disagreement is not, maybe both to some degree, the practicality and also the morality of some particular tactics. But I really appreciate that we were able to discuss it in this way. We've been speaking with Maximillian Alvarez, who's a writer based in Baltimore, dual PhD candidate at the University of Michigan, and also host of Working People, a podcast by, for, and about the working class today. Really appreciate your time and hope to be able to speak again in the future.
Thanks, David. Really appreciate it.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Here's some genuinely bizarre video of Donald Trump trying to make a point, I guess, about why he's taking vaping so seriously. And he refers to his own son. I mean, Barron Trump is his own son, at least as far as we know, as Melania's son. And there's really no other way to introduce it other than that. This is following the trend of Trump seeming to have no emotional connection to his own children beyond the fact that many times he said Ivanka has just an amazing body. We've heard that from him before. But other than that, it's hard to really see him say anything that suggests an emotional connection to his kids. Here's Trump, I guess, trying to explain why vaping is something Melania is interested in being involved in. Listen to how he refers to his own kid.
Vaping has become a very big business, as I understand it, like a giant business in a very short period of time. But we can't allow people to get sick, and we can't have our youth be so affected. And I'm hearing it, and that's how the First Lady got involved. And she's got a son together that is a beautiful young man, and she feels very, very strongly about it. She's seen it. We're both reading it.
Is this the strangest way to refer to your own kid that anybody has ever heard? Melania cares about vaping because she has a son, which is his son, Barron Trump. She has a son, and it has motivated her to care about vaping. Someday, maybe Trump would get a chance to meet her son. It almost sounds like the next thing he would say would be, this is a guy who either doesn't care about his son nor respect his wife, or, again, I mean, I know some people don't like this line, but is he experiencing such cognitive decline that this is how he's now referring to his own kids? I'm not joking here. I've been around people with Alzheimer's, and one of the things that happens is they will get sometimes confused. There will be people that they know are connected to them in some way, family members or significant others or whatever the case may be, and they recognize that they know who the person is. There is a connection, but they refer to them in a way where there's confusion about how the person is connected to them. They mention only the connection to others as if they remember the person and one connection, but not how they relate to that person. This is exactly what Trump seems to be doing here. Now, it may have nothing to do with that. This may merely be a representation of how little Trump cares about his own kid. Any normal person who's either functioning normally cognitively or is relating in a healthy way to their wife and kid would say something like, "We have a wonderful son," or something along those lines. It wasn't, "My son is affected by this." It's Melania, not even Melania, the first lady has a son, and that's why she cares about this. Melania, by the way, didn't even react, in the sense that for her, she seems totally acquainted with Donald Trump's complete lack of interest in Barron Trump. And speaking of kids, if she or he care about kids so much, they've pulled flu vaccines from the border camps. He's lent credence to anti-vaccine ideas that are extremely dangerous to children. He bullies people on Twitter while his wife claims that she's trying to work on stopping bullying. If having a kid makes her care so much about children, there's plenty more that she could be encouraging Donald Trump to do and really take that seriously. Some of the strangest video that I have seen of Donald Trump, very, very bizarre. Curious what you think about it. It's been about 3 months since this, what I call my $829 10-minute doctor's visit. I told the initial part of the story before, and I've been getting emails from people, including podiatrists, saying, "David, what ended up happening with this?" So here's the backstory. In early June, I went to see a podiatrist because I was having some foot and knee pain. And my regular doctor suggested I go. I did all the right things. I called my insurance. I said, "Is podiatry covered?" They said, "Yes, it is." I said, "Do I need a referral?" They said, "No, you don't." Do I need pre-authorization? They said, "No, you don't. Just book it and go. You'll pay your $40 copay or whatever it is for specialist, and you're going to be good to go." And I went, and the doctor said, "Hey, okay, I think the problem you're having is that because of your flat arches, it's throwing your entire ankles and knees out of alignment. You should get some custom orthotic insoles," which, of course, they didn't make there, nor are they covered by insurance. The orthotics are $350 or $375. Here's a prescription. Bada boom, bada bing, you're out of here. Okay, I pay my copay. And then a few weeks later, I get a bill saying your visit with the specialist, which was 10 minutes, maybe it was 10 minutes. It was 10 minutes with me spending 3 minutes sitting there while the podiatrist types up notes, right? That was a $460 or so visit. You've paid your $40 copay. It's not covered, so you owe the other $420 or so. And I called the insurance, and I want to tell a shorter version of this since I've already told this. I call my insurance, and they say, "Well, podiatry is covered, and you don't need a referral, and you don't need prior authorization, but your diagnosis was pes planum, or as we would say in English, flat feet. And that is not a diagnosis that is covered." To which I said, "Wait a second. I'm not a doctor. Do you agree I'm not a doctor?" Yes, we agree you're not a doctor. How would I know whether to expect a diagnosis which would not be covered? It doesn't really seem to make any sense. So in the end, what was potentially going to happen is I was going to owe, for this 10-minute visit, which results in me getting some orthotics, $350 or $375 for the orthotics, and $440 or so, whatever, for the specialist visit. It was going to be roughly $830. Now, I got a bunch of emails from podiatrists saying, "David, I deal with this with patients, and it's crazy that on the basis of a diagnosis code, you would either be covered or not covered. But here are a bunch of other codes that this is not insurance fraud, but these are just other ways that you can report that someone came in with a pain related to a foot condition, and here's how I would often code it." So I played the game. Now, at a certain point, I mean, listen, the truth is, if this ends up costing me $829, I'm fortunate enough to be in a situation where it's not going to bankrupt me. And I'm putting a lot of time into this, but I do want to see it through just to see, like, how long will it take to ultimately navigate this and what will be the result? So I got in touch with the specialist. They put me in touch with some billing person who, of course, should they even exist in a system that makes sense? Is that even a position that we should have, inflating the bureaucratic cost of these visits? I would say no. They said, "We're going to resubmit it. I'm going to talk to the doctor. If the doctor agrees to resubmit it in a different way, we will do that. Call us in a month." I called in a month and was told that billing person had left and not on good terms. Therefore, no one there knows what it is that they were working on. So we again started from scratch. And I am here to report to you today that there has been no progress whatsoever. The specialist has said, we're not going to start charging you late fees. We understand that we're in the process of trying to work this out, so you're not going to owe us late fees. But it has finally been resubmitted to my insurance with some other diagnostic codes. And I'm waiting to hear back, and it could be several more weeks before they either accept or deny the claim. Consider all of the people, and for what was 7 minutes of clinical time and 3 minutes of note-taking time, consider not only what I might end up paying, but the amount of hours that I've put into this, again, partially for you to have stuff to talk about on the show because of the curiosity of the entire thing, but this has been hours of my time. Add up all of the hours of everybody else who's been involved. There's people at my insurance company that have to process this claim 2 times. Multiple people at the specialist's office, including the podiatrist himself, working on resubmitting this. It's insane, the system that we have. And in the end, I'm not really any closer to avoiding an $829 10-minute doctor's visit than I was when this all started. Now, if you're going to email me and say, David, in my country, custom orthotic insoles are only $100. I already heard from 24 of you. I understand that. I trust me, I get that even the price of $350 is a crazy price. And people from Canada and the UK saying, I just got custom ones for $80, $100, and the insurance even covers it in some cases. Don't even depress me further with those stories. I get that piece is going on, but that's the latest, and I will certainly keep you abreast of any developments there. We have a voicemail number, 219-2-DAVID-P. Here is, sometimes talking points just spread like a virus and nobody actually examines the content of them. Here's one example about polling. Take a listen.
Hey, David. It's Josh from Virginia. I was just curious. I had heard that a majority of the polls for presidential candidates are done over landlines, and I was wondering, does that give it a more of an older voter influence on those polls,
right,
where a majority of people in the younger ages are having cell phones? I wasn't sure. I had heard that a majority of them were done over landlines, and I was just curious on your take on that. Anyway, thanks for your show. It's awesome. Keep up the good work.
So the general talking point is that polling is very establishment-centric because they are oversampling older folks who tend to be more establishment or on the right. Even within the Democratic Party, the older folks tend to be more establishment. They are using landlines, which tends to be more older folks than younger folks that have them. You really got to look at it poll by poll, but generally speaking, this isn't the case. When I looked at a bunch of the recent polls, most of them are sampling older folks in proportion to their representation in the population, adjusted slightly for the fact that older folks are actually more likely to go out and vote. So you do need to adjust the sample slightly on that basis. The Economist YouGov poll that we talked about earlier today did not use landlines. It was using web-based interviews. I get calls on my mobile phone all the time from pollsters all the time. I mean, every few months or something like that. So no, you can look at the methodology for each poll, and I don't think it serves us to criticize polls for reasons that aren't good ones. There are many ways in which we can add caveats and nuance to our understanding of polling, but there's a lot of people who just are saying it's all fake because they use all landlines and are polling mostly old people. This just isn't true in general, and I encourage you to look at the methodologies of polls to confirm it for yourself. Don't take my word for it. I mean, really don't. We've got a great bonus show for you today. Get access to the bonus show by becoming a member or a patron at joinpacman.com or patreon.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.